Good afternoon and welcome for this podcast. I am Aurelio Porfiri, and today I am very glad that I have as a guest Nicholas Clapton, that is a singer and also a teacher, but he is also an expert about the topic we will talk today. Because you may know that yesterday, April 21st, it was the 100th anniversary of the death of a very famous singer. And Nicholas Clapton wrote a book about the singer, and we are talking about Alessandro Moreschi. Moreschi is known maybe for a quite famous recording, and is called the last Castrato, and it was called l'angelo di Roma, the angel of Rome, because of his voice. So I want to thank Nicholas for his participation in my podcast, and I want to ask him first why he got an interest about Alessandro Moreschi.
A good question, and I have a good answer, I think. I've been singing as a countertenor for over 30 years, and countertenors often sing repertoire from the 17th and 18th century, and therefore we come across the castrati very frequently. We are frequently called to replace them, substitute for them in the music of people such composers as Handel, Vivaldi, all of the Italian school from Monteverdi through to as late as even some of my colleagues, Bellini. So I came across Moreschi first when I was looking into the whole history of this phenomenon, and especially there's a wonderful book by a man called Heriot about the castrati, which was written many years ago. It's a wonderful book, not least because it's full of inaccuracies. It's full of made up history. He was not a researcher, he was a diplomat, and he would never let a good story pass, even if they weren't always totally accurate. And he wrote about Moreschi and the phenomenon of Moreschi having been recorded and having been the last castrato, which indeed he was. And these records, of course, I was immediately fascinated by the idea that recordings of a castrato, which for most people is a long, distant, long forgotten phenomenon from the 18th century and earlier, existed. And indeed, there are nearly 24 tracks. And I became very interested in this. And I was doing a concert in London with some colleagues from the Royal Academy of Music, where I used to teach. And a lady came up to me at a drinks reception after the concert and said, "I'm a publisher. I publish biographies. Tell me a few musicians who need to have a biography written about them who do not have one." And I don't know why, Moreschi's name came into my mind, and I said, "How about this?" And I told her a little about the phenomenon, the recordings, the whole musicological, religious and political situation in which he lived. And she said, "Yep, I like the idea of that." And within a week, I had a contract to write the book, and it happened. So
Yes, and
that's
also your book.
briefly.
Can you remind our listener what is the name of your book?
The book was published in two slightly different versions. The larger one is called Moreschi and the Voice of the Castrato, and it was published by House Publications and is still available. It's still available. It's still in print at £16.99. There is also, interestingly enough, I have had a long association with the town where Moreschi was born, Montecompatri, near to Frascati, and an association there published an Italian edition of this book. So it exists in Italian as well, and also in French.
Also in French. And
Yes.
when you started to write the book, how much do you know about Moreschi?
I knew what was written in the standard dictionaries, the standard encyclopedias, and in this book by Angus Heriot, The Castrato in Opera, and that was about all. And it was very interesting trying to find out more, which is why, of course, I went to Montecompatri in the first place. and had some wonderful experiences meeting people, some of whom were a little hesitant, but some of whom were very helpful. In fact, many of whom were very helpful, not least the parish priest who helped me to look in the parish records. He had worked in Britain, so had excellent English. My Italian was not so good in those days. It's better since, I hope. And people were very, very helpful and became very, very interested. They already had a choir, Coro Alessandro Moreschi, and they held a little festival. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I became involved in that. And for many years, I used to go and sing repertoire that he had sung and other repertoire associated with the castrati at their little festival in the spring every year.
And what is the most astonishing thing that you discover in the process of writing your book?
Oh, gosh, that's a difficult question to answer. I think the most extraordinary thing of all is the voice, because it does give us a glimpse into a long forgotten world. The way the voice is constructed. I remember coming up with a phrase in English almost suddenly, on the spur of the moment, as we say, that Moreschi sounded a little bit like Pavarotti on helium. You know, if you inhale helium and then try to speak, your voice goes very, very high. And everybody speaks, a man will speak at least an octave higher and sing also an octave higher. Because the point about Moreschi is that unlike countertenors today, who sing nearly all the time in falsetto, he sang in his voce di petto. He sang in his real speaking voice. To our ears, unbelievably high. So he sang like a tenor who is singing impossibly high, in full chest voice. And then the sound flips into a much more almost flautato soprano sound at around the C sharp, about an octave above do centrale, as you would expect. It's like a tenor, but an octave too high, as it were. And this was very, very interesting to look into this and to try to work out how his voice actually functioned. And then to, of course, to go into the extraordinary history of the castrati in, well, particularly in Italy, where they came from in Europe, which is still something of a mystery. We know they were around in France in the 16th century. We know there were eunuch slaves in the Ottoman Empire very early. Well, not the Ottoman Empire, but in the caliphates in North Africa and in the Near East and in the Middle East and also in Spain. At some time, something happened there. We don't really know what. There were also castrato singers in the choirs of the Byzantine Empire, most famously in the choir of Hagia Sophia in what was then Byzantium, Constantinople, now Istanbul. And they all disappeared after Constantinople was sacked in the Fourth Crusade in 1214 by the forces of what you might call a Western European army. And they all just kind of disappeared. And then they may have turned up in funny places like Norman kingdoms in Sicily. How they got from there to Spain, to France, to the papal choir, and to various noble courts in Italy is still something of a mystery.
But I want to ask you one thing, and then I want you to help to give some definition. So for our listeners that maybe are not familiar with this forgotten word, as you mentioned, and it is. Before I want to ask you something. You say that you sing as a countertenor for more than 30 years, so it's a long time. Yes. And I'm sure also in your very young age, you came in contact with this recording from Moreschi, the famous recording where he sings some sacred arias and other things. So before writing the book, what was your impression of this recording?
I knew very, very little. I think I might have heard the most famous of the recordings, which is probably the track of the Gounod Ave Maria, based on the first prelude of Bach's 48 Preludes and Fugues, the Gounod Ave Maria. I'm sure I had heard that, and I'm sure then in my innocence and ignorance, I thought, gosh, that's strange, and thought very little else about it, because 35 years ago, I wasn't so interested as I am now in the way voices work. I was still probably then in those days trying to find out more about how my own voice worked and getting it to work well. And I suppose the more one becomes involved in the teaching of the voice, which I've also done since about 1990, the more you become interested in how the human voice functions as just a pile of muscles and ligaments and air and lungs,
Yes.
and so forth.
So for our listener, in very few words, can you give some definition, explain to them, because maybe not all of them knows well about this kind of, of singers. So what is a castrato?
A castrato singer was someone who was castrated before puberty, between the age of probably 8 and about 12, maybe 13, before puberty, to preserve the high register of their voice for the rest of their life. And this had an effect not only on their voice, but on everything to do with their body, because if you deprive the adolescent male body of the male hormones, especially testosterone, it affects the way your bones grow. Testosterone is a signal hormone to make young men grow. It also tells the bones when to stop growing. And if that doesn't exist in the body, the bones go on growing for much longer. So very often the castrati, this was not the case with Moreschi, oddly, but very often the castrati were very, very tall, and they had disproportionately small heads and very long arms and very long legs. And the caricatures we frequently see of castrati, particularly from the 18th century, were not that much of a distortion of what they may have looked like. They were often very tall. From the analysis that's been done in recent years in Italy of the remains of Farinelli, which were found in Bologna some time ago, it seems that he was nearly 2 meters high, 1 meter 90, 2 meters, which is very tall now. So in 1740, he would have been a giant.
Yeah. Yeah, and so can you tell us? Can you tell our listener what is a countertenor and what is the difference? Of course, obvious difference.
Yeah, well, we are complete men, thank God. The practice of castrating young boys has ceased, thank goodness. But we sing. Let me go back a stage. Every male adult has two voices. They have the voice you and I are talking with, and this one, the one that you might, if you were laughing a lot, if you were laughing hysterically, or if you're screaming or yelling at someone, your voice will flip into this very easily. It's basically a mechanism for the release of tension in the throat. But some people find that their voice works better and makes a more beautiful sound in the falsetto than in what is called the modal voice, which is the speaking voice. So every male voice has these two mechanisms, and countertenors find that their high mechanism, their falsetto mechanism, works better and more beautifully than their speaking voice, and therefore they use it and use it professionally. That's
so there is any difference between countertenors and falsettists?
Well, there is to some extent, because most countertenors nowadays are using almost exclusively falsetto. I'm sure all falsettisti, even historically, would have used their speaking voice, their ordinary speaking voice, as well when they were singing low, because if you want to be audible, you've got to, otherwise your voice more or less disappears. However, there are also people who are what the French tradition calls the haute contre, who are very, very high tenors, who are using their modal voice very, very high, and they can often sing in the same register as falsettists, but they are using a tenor register. They're using the full closure of their vocal cords, whereas in the falsetto register, because of mechanical changes within the throat, the vocal folds do not vibrate along their entire depth and their entire length. They vibrate on their edges, and they therefore produce a different kind of sound.
And I want to mention something that is also the occasion why I knew about your book, because as you know, our own meeting was many years ago. We met virtually, and so today is indeed the first time we talk directly. but
Yes.
we correspond. We say because
Yes.
my teacher, that I think it was him, Maestro Bartolucci, mentioned to me about your book, or that you did some research in the Sistine Chapel, or you talked
Yes,
with it.
I did.
Yes,
I was very much helped by the director of the Sistine, of the archives of the Sistine Chapel, who was
yes.
very, very, very helpful to me.
And
And
I want to mention to you something, because I think it's, you, of course, you know already very well. You know that one of the students of Moreschi was Domenico Mancini.
oh yes,
Domenico Mancini, that was a falsettist, and you know that the falsettist, indeed, so Alessandro Moreschi died in 1922, so 100 years ago exactly. But he has a students, among them Domenico Mancini, and the falsettists basically remain in the Sistine Chapel until the time of Maestro Bartolucci, because he was the one that removed them in
uh-huh.
favor of the Pueri Cantores. And I heard a recording of Domenico Mancini. There are very few recordings, but his voice is really fascinating. I mean, I am so fascinated by the voice of the people that can sing with this kind of range, that the man can sing this kind of range. So, what do you know about Domenico Mancini?
Well, not as much as perhaps I would like to. I think one of the most fascinating things about Mancini is that yes, he was a pupil of Moreschi, and he was heard by Maestro Perozzi, who, as we all know, was very against the castrati, wanted to
Yeah,
get rid of them,
yes.
and succeeded in so doing, and pushed out Mustafa and all that story of the
And
big
he
change that
didn't want
happened.
Mancini because he thought he was a
Thought
castrato.
Mancini was a castrato, exactly. So
Yeah.
what Mancini was, like any good student should be, was a very good imitator of his teacher. And I think it is wonderful that he was able to do that so well that Perozzi thought he was a castrato.
But
He
this is
should have.
what
He
also
should have.
Moreschi asked him. There is a famous recording of Mancini that he remember about his lesson with Moreschi, and he say, "Oh, but
Yes,
Moreschi always sing himself, and he asked
exactly.
me to imitate what he was doing."
Exactly, exactly. And to be able to imitate not only what he was doing technically, but actually the type of sound, the fullness of sound that the castrato would have had from singing in this basically registro di petto, voce di petto,
Mm.
rather than with just the edges of the vocal folds. It is a remarkable achievement that Mancini was able to do that. One must admire him for it. And that he was able to fool Perozzi, I think, is a wonderful irony, a
And he
marvelous
did.
irony.
There is. I don't know if you know about this, but probably you did. But you know that Mancini wrote some kind of his memories, and he talked about the last year of Perosi, because they were very complicated, because Perosi was mentally ill, and so there
Yes,
were
yes,
many problems, and also he talked with resentment about the decision of Maestro Bartolucci to replace completely the falsettists, because he say, "Oh, but the falsettists are guide of the children," and this was used for many years, and it was very
yes.
successful.
Yes, how very interesting. I know of those memorie, but I have never, ever been able to find a copy. I would love to find a copy of them. It's proved it.
Ah,
I did try, but it proved impossible. Maybe now with since I mean it is now 18 years, 19 years, nearly 20 years since I started work on my book. So yes, 20 years actually. So maybe it is now available online. To be honest with you, I haven't
it
looked,
is not. It
and
is
I
not.
should. It is not.
It
Ah,
is not.
caspita. It's a shame.
No, it is not. But I can tell you that yeah, they are very interesting. Yes,
I'm
and
sure they are.
he say about yes, and I want also to tell you about something. Many years ago, as you may remember, I was one of the organists of St. Peter's Basilica, and I play
Yes.
for the people audience on Wednesday. And every Wednesday there was a singer that sing the psalm. And one
Yes.
of these Wednesday, it came one singer that was a countertenor,
Aha.
probably that was the first time in my life that I hear alive, and I was so fascinated. I mean, the voice. But why for you the voice of a countertenor is so fascinating? Okay, you are a countertenor, so you should not be maybe the one to say it, but according to your experience, why the people uh, is fascinated about this kind of weird voice? Because you
I
see a
know it
man
is. It is a
singing.
very strange thing. I really don't know what that's about. I have a feeling. I mean, what is very interesting is that a lot of people, particularly people who are not professional musicians, who are just lovers of music, are completely fascinated by the what they call the purity of the sound. I mean, in England, there's a great obsession with, the purity of the boy soprano voice. And
Mm,
this seems to extend to the countertenor as well. I think the otherworldliness, the strangeness is a part of that fascination. And this may relate to people's psychological, even maybe psychosexual way of relating to sound. I don't know. This is a this is not a topic for half an hour's talk. This is a topic for 20 years research, probably.
and
I think
according to your opinion, in which country these kind of voices are more appreciated?
Well, it seems to be more or less everywhere now. I mean, when I started out singing, which was really in the early 80s, there were certainly falsettist countertenors. Let's use countertenor in the modern sense. There were people singing in America, a few. There were people singing in Germany, one or two. There was certainly one or two in France and the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, but nearly all of them were in England. Nearly all of them were in England, and that had an awful lot to do with a supposed tradition which we had had in English cathedral and chapel choirs for what, 500 or 600 years. Now, one must say that a lot of doubt has been cast on the truth of that tradition in recent years, and it seems that an awful lot of what has been regarded in the last 60, 70, maybe even longer years as countertenor repertoire isn't at all. And there were some mistakes made after the Second World War when the wonderful composer Michael Tippett was running the music at a college in London called Morley College, which was kind of evening classes, adult education centre in London. And he loved very much the music of Henry Purcell. And in the music of Henry Purcell, you very often see solo parts marked countertenor, countertenor, counter, all over the place. In some pieces, sometimes three or four of them. And he couldn't find voices that worked. It was too high for many tenors. And if a female contralto sang it, he didn't like the sound quality he made. He said it was too thick and opaque. And then he heard about this singer called Alfred Deller, who was singing in the choir of Canterbury Cathedral. And he went to Canterbury and he heard Deller. And for him, this was a revelation. And he said, "You are an alto," because everybody used to call themselves male alto, a man who sang in the alto range, the contralto range, if you like. You're not a male alto. I will call you a countertenor. Well, yes, Michael Tippett might have called him a countertenor, and Alfred Deller was a wonderful singer, but he's probably very, very much different from what Purcell thought of when he was thinking of a countertenor, which was much more like the non-falsetto French haute contre, which was always a very rare voice. The falsettist who sings better in falsetto than in voce di petto is rare enough, but a high tenor who can sing very, very high in a very light registration and in a very, what's the word I want? Well, just in a beautiful way, is much rarer. And there are still very few of them around. There are some, and singing now very beautifully, but it's a very, very rare voice.
And to conclude, if someone want to learn to sing like a countertenor, for you, where are the best places where someone can go to learn?
Ooh, well, that's a very interesting question. I was never taught by a countertenor, and in many ways, I'm very glad because there was quite a lot of bad bad teaching going on back in the 70s and early 80s. I was always taught by people who were either in one case pianists or by women. And really, if you want to learn to sing, it doesn't matter who you learn from as long as they know about the voice. And the real differences between a falsettist countertenor and a female mezzo soprano are anatomical, but what the singer does is very similar. And it doesn't matter what sex or what gender you are. If you sing well, if you're taught well to sing, you will be able to sing with that voice if there is the basic material there. You need someone with a sympathetic ear, someone who can teach you how to manage the change between the voices. It's not easy, and I haven't sung at all today. It's difficult, and you need to learn how to do that. But any teacher who knows about singing can teach you that. The problem is not teaching a countertenor how to sing well. It's finding a teacher who knows how to teach anybody how to sing well, because as you know, as well as I do, there is a huge amount of appallingly bad teaching in this world.
Yes, and that is a reality, but we hope that this kind of tradition that is so important also for musicology, because the music was produced for this kind of voices in reality, will continue to exist. And we, of course, want always to remember people like Alessandro Moreschi, that was certainly a protagonist of his time, and unfortunately today is very much forgotten. And this is something that, of course, we don't like. So I want to thank Nicholas Clapton for his participation and for the insights that he has given to us, that I'm sure are very interesting. And I want to thank our listener and remember them that this is for the Cantus newsletter. So if you want to subscribe, you go to cantus.substack.com, and then you will subscribe, and you will have a lot of content, including podcast, scores, articles, videos, and many other things. There are different subscriptions plan, so you can decide which one you want to choose. So thank you again to Nicholas Clapton, and I will see you next time.